Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take sources you send us, dig into them, and pull out the really important, interesting stuff for you.
Basically, yeah. It's a way to get up to speed on something complex without drowning in information.
Exactly. And today we're tackling a pretty notorious group from Philadelphia, the K&A Gang.
The source we're working from today is primarily excerpts from a Wikipedia article on them.
And our mission essentially is to trace their story. Where did they come from? How did they evolve from burglary to, well, other things?
Yeah.
And who are the key players?
Right. And there's this hook, isn't there? This image of, like, suited burglars.
Yeah.
Who then later get involved in Philly's whole meth capital situation.
Yeah,
it's quite a contrast.
It really is. So let's unpack that. The name first, K&A Gang. It's literal, right? Kensington and Allegheny.
That's it, the intersection. They came up after World War II, mostly Irish-American guys. And for a good chunk of the late 20th century, they were, well, a dominant force in that specific criminal underworld in Philly.
And their initial focus, you mentioned burglary and theft.
Yeah, that was their bread and butter early on.
And not just in Philly, apparently. They were hitting places up and down the East Coast.
That's right. And the source mentions a particular focus on wealthier Jewish suburbs around Philadelphia.
Huh. Wonder why those specifically. But what about their methods? This is the interesting part.
It really is. They reportedly made a deliberate choice not to carry guns during burglaries.
Which seems counterintuitive for burglars,
Right. But the thinking was apparently that getting caught with a weapon meant way more jail time.
Ah, okay. A calculation then. Avoiding the really stiff sentences.
Exactly. And then there's the other thing, the suits.
Yeah. Professional suits.
Yeah.
To do burglaries.
Seems so. The idea was to blend in, look less suspicious, not your typical beanie guys skulking in the shadows.
Almost cinematic, isn't it?
Yeah.
So how were they organized back then? Was it one big boss?
Not really, no. The article describes it as more horizontal, multiple crew chiefs, each with their own influence and crew. It names a couple of prominent ones, like William Willie Sears and Louis Jr. Cripplebauer.
Gotcha. So influential figures, but not a strict hierarchy. And they weren't operating in a vacuum, were they? They had connections.
Oh, yeah, definitely. They were plugged into the wider criminal network.
Like who?
Well, the Scarfo crime family, the Philly mob, basically.
Right.
Also, the Genovese family faction down in South Jersey, the Philadelphia Greek mob, even local Jewish-American gangsters.
Wow.
And it mentions ties to independent drug operations, hijacking crews. They were well connected.
That's quite a network. The source even floats alleged ties to the Provisional IRA.
It does, which if true adds a whole other dimension, international links.
Definitely. And they operated outside Philly, too. Something about a Hallmark gang.
Yeah, down in North Carolina. And
Yeah.
supposedly worked with the Dixie Mafia at times. They got around.
Then there's the Pottsville heist. 1959. This sounds like a big one.
Huge for the time. Almost $500,000, cash and jewelry. The K&A Gang was allegedly involved.
And the tip came from showgirls, Lillian Rees and Vicki Mason.
That's the story. It kind of highlights how interconnected that whole world was. Gangsters, nightclubs, entertainment figures.
Right. Okay, so for decades, they're this, well, pretty sophisticated burglary ring. Suits, no guns, lots of connections. But then things change in the late 70s.
Yeah, the landscape shifted. A big reason mentioned is simply better home security. Alarms, sensors.
Ah, made their old methods less reliable, harder to pull off.
Exactly. Technology catches up, makes burglary less profitable, I guess.
So they had to pivot. Where did they go?
Started moving more into things like loan sharking, illegal gambling, general racketeering, standard stuff, really. But the major shift came with the rise of drug culture in the 80s, specifically methamphetamine.
Meth, right. High demand, huge profits.
Enormous profits, and that's where the K&A Gang really doubled down, shifted their main focus.
Which leads us into the early 80s and Philadelphia getting this really grim nickname, meth capital of the world.
Yeah, pretty stark. There's a quote in the source from a Philly police officer reported by the AP around 83 saying just that.
And the K&A Gang was central to this, along with the Junior Black Mafia.
That's what the article suggests, yeah. They were apparently major players in the meth trade booming then.
So who led that transition? Who were the key K&A figures moving into meth?
The names that come up initially are Frank the Beard, Zap Acosta, and John Carlisle Burkery.
Okay.
And they reportedly had some serious connections themselves. Angelo Bruno, Raymond Martirano from the Philly mob,
Right.
and also John McCullough, who was the boss of the Roofers Union Local 30.
The Roofers Union. That keeps popping up. Why was that connection important?
It seems those connections, especially with McCullough and the Union, helped them expand their turf, particularly into Northeast Philadelphia, and get into new rackets beyond Kensington.
Okay. But Berkery's story gets complicated, right?
Mm.
He ended up fleeing the country.
He did, got indicted in '82 on meth trafficking charges, and took off for Ireland.
Ireland. Why Ireland?
Well, the article mentions alleged contacts within the IRA. He managed to stay underground there for 5 years.
Wow. Until 87.
Yep. Then he was caught, extradited back to the U.S., and put on trial.
And didn't he admit to a big meth deal during the trial?
Yeah, with Chelsea's Boris, the head of the Philly Greek mob, which, underlines those connections we talked about earlier.
Absolutely.
And there was testimony from another guy, Ronald Rayton, saying he supplied Berkery with loads of P2P.
P2P. That's the precursor chemical for making meth, right?
Exactly. Prosecutors argued that Berkery, Zappacosta, and Martorano were actually trying to corner the whole meth market in Philly.
A monopoly plan. But with Berkery gone for those 5 years, who took charge of the K&A meth operations?
Carl Better Days. Jackson stepped up, alongside Zappacosta.
There's Jackson, okay.
Yeah. They ran things until they got convicted, late in '87, actually just a week after Berkery was found guilty, too.
Busy week for the courts. And Jackson made serious money.
Reportedly around $4 million in drug profits, but both he and Zappacosta got hit with life sentences.
Under that drug kingpin law, the Continuing Criminal Enterprise statute.
That's the one, CCE. Designed for exactly these kinds of high-level drug operators.
Oh.
Heavy penalties.
And it wasn't just them. The authorities took down a wider network.
Oh, yeah. 22 other K&A affiliates were indicted around the same time on federal drug manufacturing charges.
So a major operation.
Huge. They estimated the operation produced something like $10 million worth of meth speed in hidden labs across PA. They could apparently crank out up to 100 pounds at a time.
Good grief. And they had specific roles, like procuring the chemicals.
Right. Edward Looney was named as the guy getting the P2P, even had help from someone up in Toronto, apparently. And Jackson handled distribution up in New York.
So a pretty sophisticated drug enterprise.
Yeah.
Even with Jackson and Zappacosta lockup, the meth business didn't just stop.
Nope. Roy Stalker emerged as the next key player.
Stalker. Okay. And he did things differently, like aligning with the mob.
Yeah, interestingly, he made a deal with the Scarfo crime family, specifically through Albert Reds Pontani.
What, for protection?
Seems like it. Protection and profit sharing. He ran his own meth manufacturing setup in Northeast Philly from about '81 to '86 and paid tribute, basically, to the Scarfo outfit.
So the connections continued, just maybe formalized differently.
Right. And Stalker wasn't just into meth, allegedly also extortion, loan sharking, even back to burglary. Diversified, I suppose.
Till he got caught, too.
Yep. Convicted in February '91. The charge was operating a meth ring worth, get this, $52 million between '81 and '87.
$52 million. Wow. And he had his own crew involved.
He did. The article lists quite a few names. Raymond Brown, James Lefty Shannon, Terry Lees, who was the cook, and William Stern, who was actually president of the Roofers Union then.
There's the Roofers Union again. It's like a constant thread.
It really is. Also, Robert Irish Bobby Caller, supposedly an enforcer, Michael Caputo, Barry Salzberg, quite the list.
So that union connection was deep and persistent. The Traits brothers are mentioned too, right? Also linked to the Roofers Union and K&A.
Correct. Connected through Local 30, they were indicted much later, early 2000s, for murdering Robert Hammond.
Why?
They allegedly thought Hammond was informing on their meth operation, which apparently involved K&A members.
So the violence associated with the drug trade comes through clearly there.
Definitely. And John Goodwin, another name mentioned, former K&A burglar, also a Roofers Union member, he was apparently part of the Traits brothers' meth ring, too.
It's just layer upon layer of connections. The article lists so many other names, too, from different eras.
It does. You see names like Charles Chick Goudreau, Francis James Brewer from the earlier days, then later figures involved in the meth trade like John Gerard, James McKenzie, Edward Looney again, William Chucky McIlvaine. It shows the scope and history.
Yeah. And John L. McManus is mentioned as an associate of many of these guys, plus family links to the Traits trial. It paints a picture of a very interwoven community in a way.
It really does. A long-standing network spanning generations almost.
Okay, so let's circle back to the structure. We said early on, during the burglary phase, it was more horizontal, decentralized, with crew chiefs.
Right.
How did that change when mess became the main focus around 1980?
It seems to have shifted towards a more hierarchical setup, more top-down.
Makes sense for managing a complex drug operation, maybe?
Probably. The source highlights these leadership pairings during the main meth era, roughly 80 to 91. First Zappacosta and Burglary,
Uh-huh.
then Zappacosta and Jackson after Burglary fled,
Right.
and then arguably Zappacosta and Stalker, though Stalker also seemed to run his own significant operation in parallel for a time before taking over more broadly. It suggests more centralized control was needed.
Okay. So, summing up this whole deep dive,
Yep.
we've traced the K&A Gang's journey from this, like, oddly formal burglary crew in suits
Yeah, avoiding guns.
to becoming a major force in Philadelphia's meth trade, with a much more structured organization and presumably more violence.
Exactly. And throughout, we see these crucial connections to the La Cosa Nostra, other local groups, that persistent link with the Roofers Union. It shows how they adapted and networked within the criminal world.
It's that initial contrast that really sticks with you, though. The nonviolent image morphing into the meth capital players. It's the dramatic evolution.
It really is. And hopefully, for you listening, this dive gave you a solid, concise overview of their history and how they operated.
So, maybe a final thought to leave you with. Considering how long the K&A Gang lasted, how they adapted from burglary to meth, what does that tell us about why some criminal networks persist for so long?
That's a good question. Is it adaptability? Strong local roots? The ability to forge alliances? Or maybe how does their shift in crime burglary to drugs mirror bigger changes in society itself?
Lots to think about there. How these organizations evolve and the impact they have, long after the headlines fade.